Good morning and welcome to the Now Morning Show, where we dubbed it Talk Me Things Tuesdays. We're having a conversation that we've had already, but we'll continue to have until we have redress. We are addressing the root causes of gender-based violence, and to do that this morning, we are joined by Dr. Ann Barratt, the head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of West Indies via Zoom. Dr. Barratt, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Ayinka. Thank you for having me.
We certainly had to, because as established, we do need to continue to have this conversation. But to start, we'd like to explore first off a basic definition of gender-based violence, if you will.
Of course, gender-based violence is any form of violence, physical, psychological, emotional, financial, mental, etc., that is targeted against a person as it is rooted in their gender expression, their gender roles, and their gender responsibilities and their gender relations in general terms, as it is defined by a society. Therefore, gender-based violence can be executed upon or executed by any person of any gendered expression.
I quite appreciate that latter part, where we establish that it can be expressed or, as we say, received by any person, which means while we have a lot of focus on gender-based violence where women are victims, it is also very possible and very present that men are victims as well. Yes?
Indeed, and the reason why there is this continued focus and reporting and concern about violence against women and girls in particular, it's because of the frequency with which it occurs and the prominence of death. So, in some spaces, it is femicide. So it's not to the exclusion of any others. It is just the frequency makes it really, really concerning.
Understandably so. Now, you have made the distinction and also talked about the fact that there are significant differences in numbers and even severity. Can we get a little bit of a statistical report, if you will? How frequently are we seeing women and girls being the victims, just so that we have a concrete idea in our minds?
As we shift into 2024, we've shifted. It's the second week of the year. We remain for some time with the 1 in 3 statistic. And for men, we have the 1 in 6, 7. And that's a very generalized global statistic. And it has not changed severely since. But as you can see, 1 in 3 is quite severe, because if you sit in your room with 3 women, 1 person in there, by virtue of that statistic, would have experienced some form of gender-based violence. And similarly for men, 1 in 6 or 7 would have experienced it. Of course, it will vary across countries and regions, but we fall within that statistical range at present, and it is a worrying statistic, still is.
I agree with you completely. But some of my worry lies in the types of gender-based violence that you mentioned earlier, because we can be looking well beyond physical or even mental, but also financial as well. I'm wondering what is the most prominent or prevalent here in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, the one that is reported in media, of course, would be that which is physical. And of course, the physical which escalates to the extreme, death. But what we have, I would call it simmering, persistent forms of violence, are psychological, financial, emotional, verbal. These occur on an everyday. But we say to ourselves in our communities, well, it ain't so bad, if you would allow me to use local parlance. It's not like you're getting beat, or, it's not like you're under threat. But these other things are that simmering aggression, violence, dysfunctional conflict that escalates into terrorism. Because dysfunctional conflict occurs, and we must be clear that you can have people arguing with each other, and that is not necessarily GBV, but when it escalates into this persistent, almost terrorism against another individual, whether it is in the sexual, financial, psychological, whatever. But the ones that I would say are those persistent, almost covert forms that occur as norm would include the psychological the emotional, the financial, the verbal.
Dr. Barratt, we have gotten some significant insight just to those basic definitions. But let's get into action. How do we first off identify those sorts of, or if you can pick two, because there's so many versions, how do we identify persons who may be victims or even within ourselves that we are being subjected to gender-based violence of any of those varieties?
It is extremely difficult unless it is obvious. And I want to start with that. I also want to say that hindsight is a lot better than foresight. Sometimes when you sit on the outside, a solution or a perspective seems obvious. Oh, you should have known. We say that all the time. We blame the victim, unfortunately, which we need to stop as a community. Now, sometimes you may know a person in your close ties, your community, your family, your friend group, and you see that their mood has changed, the way they express themselves, what they are willing to tell you, how open they are to you being in their presence. You may see bruises if it's physical. And in that case, you might be able to ask a question. But sometimes this is very well hidden because of shame and blame and reputation and threat and so much more. When it comes to sexual violence, it's even more difficult because of the taboos associated with sexuality in our society. Though we are at once hypersexual, we are at once very repressed, and sex is very taboo. So it is difficult sometimes for another person who is not familiar with an individual's lived experiences to tell. That's one. So it really takes a person coming to confide in you and you listening without judgment. Most important. The second part of it, if you are a person experiencing or even perpetrating, and sometimes you may not see it as violence. So, say, for example, you're in a relationship and you're approaching a breakup, and this person says, I really want to separate. And the other person, and you say, well, you have the belief, well, whatever, I'm in a relationship, I must fight for it. We must remain strong and committed. And you're doing whatever it takes to save this one love. But in doing so, you start to perpetuate your expectations, gendered expectations, as violent. And so you have to call yourself into question. Hey, can I let go and let this person be? And then probably we can have a conversation. Those are normative behaviors that escalate sometimes into violence. And we say, but I never expected this person to do this. It's because they've moved from the normative to the extreme as frustrations build. So that's a very big way of answering your question. But to directly answer, you can know if you know the person and their relationship, but it is extremely difficult to tell amongst your coworkers, your friends, your classmates, your colleagues, even family members, because this is an experience that is marked by shame and failure and blame and expectations that affect someone's ability to become human.
Okay.
So you have to be very patient, very vigilant, and always listen without judgment.
That was my exact point of return, listening without judgment. Because as you rightfully said, it's difficult to spot, but we have to do something or we'll be continuously having the same conversation. So in terms of what we can do, listening without judgment, we are not psychiatrists, psychologists, and in many cases dealing with our own burdens, so we have our own judgment. We have our own problems. Let's talk a little bit about institutions that exist to help us navigate these things as individuals, as a community, as a country. What can we do?
Of course. Someone will come to you and confide. And what I would say is you act with empathy. We don't diffuse responsibility and say, look, you see me? I had a problem. Let somebody else deal with that. No, you take a moment just to hear somebody. So that's how you approach it. It's almost as if you say, let this person just express, and then we direct them to what will be our referral pathways.
Mhm.
And we can go through the state. We can go through civil society. We can go through faith-based organizations. That's just like three big categories.
Mhm.
Of course, in terms of the state, you have the reporting structure, you have the victim support structure, you have the health support structure, and so forth, the counseling, the medical. I'm not going to name them all, but those are the
Right.
areas that you will go to at the state. And it's important that we take the services of the state because here we have a picture of what is going on and we have professionals who are accessible to us. It is sometimes difficult and frustrating, I'm not going to lie to you, but it is necessary that that multi-level approach occurs. When you move from the state structure, whether it's the police service, whether it's with victims and support, whether it is shelters, wherever it may be, the hospital, you then move to civil society. So, for example, you have the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, you have the Rape Crisis Center, you have the many organizations, both in Trinidad and Tobago, that provide support, provide recovery, provide so much social psychological services. Of course, it's not, unending because the resources are always limited, but you can have that to augment. Then you have your faith-based organizations, which we know are very influential in people's feelings of support and safety and security, as well as belief systems. And it is in this site where we must have support, not reproduction of violence as norm. So when we go to our counselors and our safety houses and all of these things as it rests in our faith-based community, we must find a safe space that is non-judgmental there. So I have not named the institutions by heart because there are so many. I don't want to say one in particular, but I would say if you find yourself needing to be an active bystander, then you approach the state services, law enforcement, health services, victim support, the civil society, which provides psychosocial services, and then your faith-based organizations, which provide, of course, the fundamental support to feel solace and security and capacity to continue for many of the people in our society.
Dr. Barratt, you've beautifully explored that multi-pronged approach, if you will, in terms of what we can do. But I must mention the late Basdeo Pandey was instrumental in bringing forth laws that have significantly impacted domestic violence and gender-based violence as a whole as well. Can you, as a closing thought, perhaps propose some things that we can see on a political level or a higher level at least, apart from these institutions that you've recognized this morning, as we look forward to a way out of gender-based violence?
Ayanka, I said somewhere else, and I'll say this here as well. Our existing services are there, but we need to enhance implementation and consistency of service and scope. I think, for example, we had a very recent case and someone asked me, but this person had a protection order. How is it that they are still vulnerable? We need to examine how the multi-levels that work together can ensure that these formalized forms of protection are effective. Who do we rely on outside our own institutions? So I'm saying that multi-level framework needs to be enhanced at the level of policy. Number two, I do believe that community policing, in a way, I mean, I'm not a professional at policing, but I'm just suggesting that violence happens at a community level. It happens in a community, in a household, in a family, in a space, in a community. And so we must have that continuous engagement. I know resources are limited, but we must dedicate it because somebody has to listen with empathy, listen with non-judgment, observe, to intervene, who is trusted, reliable, and who can make a change. But my fundamental policy intervention, yes, there's legislation. Yes, these exist. Yes, there are frameworks, but the process of adjudication needs to be faster. Two, the level of response from our law enforcement continues to be a work in progress. And three, the interaction between all agencies, whether it's state-based, civil society, private sector, et cetera, needs to be more efficient. And with that, we work as a community of experts as well as bystanders to try to alleviate, mitigate, or even prevent the occurrence of this problem.
Thank you so kindly, Dr. Barratt, for so eloquently enunciating how we can approach gender-based violence here in Trinidad and Tobago. We will continue that conversation at a later date for sure. But for now, you started us on the right foot. We take a break and come back with more here on the Now Morning Show.
Hey, Choppy.
Since you know me, you know I don't be on no scene. No.